Second issue, did Jesus claim to be God?
First, Wes says that Jesus was audaciously going around claiming to be God himself. I don't think that's true. Nowhere in Mark, Matthew, or Luke does Jesus actually claim to be God in his own words. At best, it's just in John's Gospel that divine claims begin to appear. I and the Father are one. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Before Abraham was, ego eimi. I actually still don't think even these count, and we'll explain why in another video, but let's just say that they do. Even if this was Jesus explicitly claiming to be God, don't you think it's a bit suspicious that these claims only show up in our latest gospel?
First, even in John's gospel, Jesus does not walk around saying, I'm God. The claims of deity are still kind of oblique there, and they come up in the context of ministry and his conflict with the Jewish leadership. Similarly, in the earlier three Gospels, Jesus makes claims of divine authority and divine identity in the context of ministry and in a very Jewish way. Now, it's not necessarily surprising that the way Jesus claims to be God in Matthew, Mark, and Luke will look a little different from how he claims to be God in John.
Let's dive into the review of a review of a review.
The dream inside of the dream inside of the dream. What do you, can you give a quick background on Gavin Ortlund and just kind of what he's going to be discussing?
You told me, you were like, hey, I found this video. I was like, yeah, I love Gavin Ortlund. I've already seen this. And you were like, oh, I don't really know.
Bro, I feel like I'm late to the party on some of the people you watch on YouTube.
Sorry,
I'm too busy watching tech videos.
I thought you knew. No, Gavin Ortlund, he's really cool. So he is a Baptist, and a lot of his videos will center around church history, Protestantism, kind of pulling apart the lines between Protestantism and Catholicism, and he gives really robust defenses of Protestantism against both Orthodoxy and Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. But his channel is called Truth Unites. So his whole deal is that, he is the most gentle, most kind. He's awesome. Like his demeanor, you know what I mean? He reminds me a lot of like Mike Winger, where it's like, he's so gentle, he's so peaceable, he's so kind. Everything that he does, he always aims it at where we can find common ground. He's one of those, you kind of put your trust in his hands because you're like, you are disagreeing the right way.
Yeah.
So I can listen to you. Like this makes most times when Catholics and Protestants clash, it just like makes your blood boil and you're ready to go to war.
Yeah.
But he does it in such a way that is very thoughtful and very peaceful. I love it.
So last week's stream, we reviewed Wes Huff going on Joe Rogan. So that has, sparked off just video on video of people commenting and reviewing Wes Huff.
He reviewed himself. Yeah. Did you see that?
Yeah, Wes Huff reviews Wes Huff. And so who, of course, was going to come out of the woodworks? Mr. Alex O'Connor.
You can't miss an opportunity.
We
didn't miss the opportunity, so why would he? Come on.
AKA the Cosmic Skeptic. I don't know if he goes by that anymore, if that's his
he dropped
channel. But you kind of need a label before your name gets famous, and then you could switch to your name, right?
Yeah. Pints of Aquinas did.
And so he comments on the conversation and some of the claims that Wes Huff said, and it kind of made my blood boil a little bit watching it. And so,
okay, tell me why.
Well, just how it's like a horse with blinders on. I don't want to. I like Alex, I really do, and I like his interviews with people. I enjoyed the video with him and Richard Dawkins and Jordan Peterson, and I think he, at least somewhat takes an honest approach to the scriptures. But I think what I noticed is that I'm trying not to talk too much mess. I think acts like he knows more than he knows.
This is what I said to you during our meeting. When you're a Christian, when you're a skeptic, that's all you have to do. You just have to or blow one or two holes. Do you know what I mean? But when you actually believe in something and somebody keeps trying to blow holes in your thing, you have to answer. You have to go, okay, well, I got to take your objections. when you're a skeptic, that's all you have to do is give objections. You don't ever have to have an answer. But when you have the answer and people keep trying to challenge it, you have to go back to the drawing board and figure it out.
Yeah.
Which is why
Which ultimately strengthens your position.
exactly. So as a Christian, all the things that he brings up, I'm like, yeah, those are the classic. All right, fine. Those are the skeptic answers. You know, I could have pulled those out of anywhere. I could have come up with those in my sleep because they're so obvious classic skeptic answers. And they're so obvious classic skeptic answers that Christians have been answering them for years and years and years and years. Christians have answers to these things. And that's what made me so like, really, bro?
Yeah.
Like, you're going to trot these things out, and I get that they're the classic skeptic answers, but Christians have come up with good answers to this stuff. So to keep trotting them out like they're the good skeptical gotcha questions, like,
It felt like a low blow.
it's just low. Like, and that's the thing. I respect him so much. I really believe he's a lot smarter than me, that I was like, it's kind of beneath him to trot out these questions that have answers and not act like people have done their due diligence to answer these questions.
Yeah, especially even the stuff on the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's like so like picking your shots.
Oh, so tricky.
Anyway,
we'll get into it. Yeah.
Let's jump into the video.
That Wes Huff got the Bible wrong in his interview with Joe Rogan, I'd like to address 5 points in an effort to give some defense to Wes Huff. First, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Let's listen to how Wes put it, and then we'll hear Alex's response.
How similar is it to the book of Isaiah that's in the Bible?
So that one is fascinating. So this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but when we discovered the Great Isaiah Scroll, previous to that, the earliest copy of Isaiah that we had was in the Masoretic text, which is in the Middle Ages.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it was literally 1,000 years. We literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years. And the thing that really shocked scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that would be amazing if it were true. In fact, the Dead Sea version of the Isaiah scroll is not quite identical to the Masoretic text, that is, the one that we know from the Bible. Can you guess how many textual variants there are between the two? Take a guess. 1 that Wes forgot about? 10? 100? Try more than 2,600.
But it needs to be emphasized that the majority of these discrepancies are about tiny issues like spelling, not even necessarily errors of spelling, just differences. One scholar notes that these variations are mostly occasioned by considerations of orthography. Orthography is the conventional spelling system of a particular language, kind of like how Americans might use this spelling, color, C-O-L-O-R, but the British people weirdly put a U in that word.
Okay. I get it. Textual criticism, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's big. It's a huge field. Lots of detail and data. It's not easy. But that's tricky.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Okay, yes, Wes Huff painted with a broad brush. But it is a more fair broad brush than Alex's. And that's the thing that makes me like, really?
I just,
Really?
I don't know. I always take these arguments and people hate that I do, but I think the attitude towards these topics and towards Wes by Alex is telling, because it's like the mockery is there, and the underlying mockery is like, wow, if only you weren't stupid. You know, I don't know if I can make that
I'm
jump,
sympathetic. I'm sympathetic, at least. Like, if you thought you were dealing with a liar, I would mock them too.
yeah,
But that's the thing, is like, okay, Wes is not lying. You know what I mean? And I wouldn't even say he's exaggerating. If anybody's further from the center line of an accurate portrayal, Wes is probably closer to a center line.
Yeah.
And that's what feels really unfair and really low.
yeah, especially with like the spelling differences, and I think Alex admits it in this video, being some of the biggest areas, and there is other variables, but correct me if I'm wrong, was Wes referring to he was referring to one specific Isaiah scroll, correct? And then he was referring to the entirety of text found within the Dead Sea Scrolls, which
Right.
do make up for the discrepancies.
So Gavin gets more into it, but I'll summarize and we can kind of skip to chapter 2.
Yeah.
There are lots and lots and lots of copies of Isaiah.
Mm.
And so if you take all the copies of Isaiah and look at all the differences, like let's have 10 different documents of Isaiah and look at all the different documents between all 10, you know what I mean? If each one if 9 of them are different from the Masoretic, then you count that as 9 instead of 1. You know what I mean? And so you're multiplying differences in those cases when there's so many documents. But he gets into it. The great Isaiah scroll, which is almost the entire thing of Isaiah, which I have seen live and in person in Israel. It was amazing. Is like Wes was describing, almost exactly, outside of minor spelling differences and maybe a few prepositional phrases, almost exactly the same as the Masoretic text.
And even what you learn about differences in transcripts of certain biblical texts is oftentimes the differences, especially within even within the New Testament accounts or the gospel accounts of Jesus, these discrepancies are often validating to the validity of the text being true.
In what way?
Because if every manuscript was exactly the same, especially in the accounts of Jesus's death, burial, and resurrection, and all of the details, you would be able to know that they just copied from each other and they were just syncing up the story, telling the same story. But because there's variance in what actually occurred and happened, like minor details, like, oh no, this person was there and I saw this person instead of this person.
Well, the difference in this, so that is true, that the preponderance of different angles, that they don't exactly line up, but they do complement and not contradict, is a great benefit to the gospel. But in this case, we're talking about the same document through time. And so not only would differences really would sink that ship, where the classic kind of jab at Christians of, oh, it's a game of telephone.
Right.
Passing down, and you don't know how the game of telephone has changed. That really would sink the ship if you could find an old document and see how that game of telephone has ruined it through 1,100 years. Except this is the opposite occurrence, where it's an absolute gold star, because through 1,100 years, basically you've modernized spelling, and that's the entire difference. So
totally,
I mean, it's an amazing achievement.
And I understand that. But the thing that I was trying to get at was similar to whenever you go off of the Textus Receptus versus the Codex Sinaiticus that was developed, or, you know, with the newer Bible translations based off of the findings in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you get discrepancies like a verse or two missing in Mark, and then things like that. And people make a big deal out of that, where like, hey, you have to read the King James Bible, or you're reading an uninspired notebook because it's missing this one verse and it changes the whole. But the truth is, it doesn't matter, actually, that there are small variations in the text, because the main message, the consequential message, is maintained throughout history. And we know that message to be accurate throughout history.
Yeah. Well, I think it does matter, and I think that in the sense that the massive amount of work that is done in textual criticism to figure out, even over those two verses, whether they belong or whether they don't belong, you know, here or there. I think it does matter a great deal, and it's worth the effort. But you're still right. I remember hearing this guy, he was a Bible teacher, but he used to work radar equipment for the Navy. And he said, if you do not want your signal to be jammed, what you do is you send it over a whole bunch of different frequencies, so that even if they catch one frequency or they jam one frequency, you've spread it across so many different things. And his point was, find for me the doctrine of baptism so that you could rip it out of the Bible or change it, or, you know what I mean? and then it would be lost forever. He's like, you can't do it because it spread so far throughout the entire thing. Or the same thing, like, find me the one page that teaches the systematic theology of the Trinity, and then I'll corrupt it or rip it out of your Bible or whatever. He goes, you can't do it. There is no way to rip the single page that is the gospel out of the Bible because it's written across every single page.
Yeah.
So,
It's incredible.
yeah, Christians need to own up to the fact that there are textual variants and there are really smart people who do a really good job at trying to figure them out.
Mhm.
But I think skeptics should also be fair that the gospel message, the message that Jesus came to tell, is encoded across the entire thing, and you have to
Yeah.
grapple with the plain message, or at the very least the fact of the resurrection.
And you have to grapple with all of the hyperlinks throughout the scriptures that point at each other and tug on each other, as a Bible Project and Tim Mackey puts it, the unified story that leads to Jesus. Where do you want to go in this? Do
We'll
we
just
want to
skip
jump up?
to chapter 2.
Second issue, did Jesus claim to be God?
First, Wes says that Jesus was audaciously going around claiming to be God himself. I don't think that's true. Nowhere in Mark, Matthew, or Luke does Jesus actually claim to be God in his own words. At best, it's just in John's Gospel that divine claims begin to appear. I and the Father are one. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Before Abraham was, ego eimi. I actually still don't think even these count, and we'll explain why in another video, but let's just say that they do. Even if this was Jesus explicitly claiming to be God, don't you think it's a bit suspicious that these claims only show up in our latest gospel? If Jesus was known to be walking around claiming explicitly to be God himself, did the other 3 gospel authors just not think this was relevant? A minor, unimportant detail not worth including?
Now, Alex introduced the adverb explicitly there, if you listen carefully. That's not necessarily what a Christian must maintain. I don't think that's what Wes said. He was pretty much just summarizing a standard Christian view in the context of making other various claims.
He was walking around first century Roman-occupied Judea. He's making some pretty audacious claims to be God himself, and then he predicts his own death and resurrection.
Wes has a whole video about this, focusing on Mark's gospel. Check that out in the video description. I think Wes's position is very strong here. I've argued for this at greater length in this video. That's also in the video description. Let's just summarize this to defend Wes's claims there. First, even in John's gospel, Jesus does not walk around saying, I'm God. The claims of deity are still kind of oblique there, and they come up in the context of ministry and his conflict with the Jewish leadership. Similarly, in the earlier 3 Gospels, Jesus makes claims of divine authority and divine identity in the context of ministry and in a very Jewish way. Now, it's not necessarily surprising that the way Jesus claims to be God in Matthew, Mark, and Luke will look a little different from how he claims to be God in John.
And I feel like this has been borne out. I mean, maybe particularly in recent years, or maybe I've just been paying attention in recent years. But I feel like the evidence or the preponderance of people being able to explain these kinds of things, like, I forget who it was, but I remember seeing somebody on YouTube post, like, I'm going to walk through every single chapter of Mark and show you how Jesus claims to be God in every single chapter of Mark.
Yeah.
And so the number of people who are giving answers to this, to what Gavin called, like, the Jewish and embedded inside of his ministry, the way that Jesus is claiming to be God. And I have 2 pulled up. Can I read these to you? Okay, here's from Mark chapter 2, right at the very beginning. So this is, even if you barely grew up in church, you probably know this story. Jesus is teaching in a house. The guys can't get inside because the crowd is so thick. So they climb up onto the roof. They rip open the roof. They lower their friend down. And instead of telling him, oh, obviously you're paralyzed, like, be well, be healed, he tells him, your sins are forgiven. And here's what the people say. Why does this man speak blasphemy? Who can forgive sins but God only? Immediately, when Jesus perceived that they were thinking this, he said to them, why are you thinking these things? Is it easier to tell him, get up and walk? Or is it easier to tell him, your sins are forgiven? But so that you may know the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. So instead of backing down, they think to themselves, only God can forgive sins. And instead of saying like, oh, no, any excuse, he doubles down and he says like, yep, let me show you how, at least in this small way, how I can prove that I'm God. I mean, I think it's not that hard. It's like, this is like some 10th grade reading level, obvious, right on the face of the text.
I think it is, being able to explain these things is a problem that is improving within the church world, but I think atheists have ammo in the sense of that the average Christian for a long time was not able to give an answer.
Definitely true.
Because they weren't taught these things, and they weren't, hey, walk through. This is how you know this. This is how you give a defense for the hope that you have within. But I do think that is, it's pretty telling that the reason that he got crucified was because at the very least, the Jewish people who put him to death thought he was claiming to be God.
That was the other verse that I had pulled up.
Okay.
So Jesus is before the high priest. Again, this is in Mark. Jesus is before the high priest being accused. This is after his arrest. They are trying to find something to pin on him to drag him before the Roman authorities and get him crucified. So the high priest stood up. They're yelling at him. They're doing all this stuff to him. The high priest stood up and asked Jesus, "Why aren't you saying anything? What do you have to say about what these people are saying against you?" But Jesus answered nothing. Again, the high priest said, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" He just asked him straight out, like, give me an answer. Are you the Christ? And Jesus said, "I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his clothes, which in the law, there is a Old Testament law that says the high priest is not allowed to do this. So he was so mad, he broke the law and tore his clothes and said, "Why do we need any further witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy." So the people who heard Jesus, and I didn't pull up the one from the Gospel of John, where they all pick up stones to stone him, and Jesus says, "Well, why do you guys want to stone me?" And they go, "Because you claim to be God."
Yeah.
And again, Jesus doesn't correct them. In all these instances, other people, the people within the story, are very clear. They know that Jesus is claiming to be God, and he does not correct them.
Yeah.
So why the people within the story, his own contemporaries, understood what he was trying to claim, but 2,000 years later, outside of that context, outside of that understanding, with just barely a cursory reading of the text, apparently, you don't make the same understanding.
But bro, our modern day intellect is superior. These ancient
I'm getting fired up.
people
I'm
were
so
dumb.
sorry. I'm getting fired up.
Okay. Explain the difference between the Son of God and Son of Man, because this one is more of a nuanced thing to understand that I don't think the average Christian knows the difference. Because when you hear Son of God, you think, oh man, this is, the Son of God. He's the real deal. He's divine. And when you think Son of Man, you're like, oh, well, that's us. We're a son of a man,
Right. So I'm going to pull up two different verses. So both of these ideas come from the Old Testament.
Okay.
And actually that verse from Mark chapter 14, with what the high priest asks Jesus, is probably the perfect place to start.
Okay.
So the high priest asks him two questions that are bound up in one. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? So what he's saying is, the Christ, the Messiah, in those days, they did not necessarily think that he would be a divine figure. Throughout the Old Testament, there are hints, there are big question marks, there are like, kind of moments where you think to yourself, okay, whoever this Messiah figure is, he is more than human, but maybe he's an exalted human, maybe he's
Because the Christ or a Christ was a anointed one, or to put it simpler, the King of Israel.
Right. So
David was a Christ.
right. So in we have this word Christ that we attach to Jesus, who Christians teach is divine. So there's all this kind of religious stuff bound up in this word Christ that we attach to Jesus, and you could be forgiven for mistaking that Christ meant divinity in itself.
Or if Christ was his last name.
Or Christ was his last name. But Christ and Messiah both mean, they are a verb that describes pouring oil on someone's head. So that verb that we have in English is to anoint.
Bible Project has an awesome series on this. It's the best thing I've heard.
Everything I'm about to say just comes from their Son of Man series. So just go listen to that, you know. But so for them, it meant a very literal thing. The anointed one is someone who you have poured oil on their heads. And there are lots of earthly people who you do that to. The high priest, prophets, and kings all get oil poured on their heads as a symbolic gesture of their authority and connection to the divine. So they're connected to the divine, but there is no hypostatic union divinity, associated with that. So here's the promise that God makes to David. So David brings the tabernacle up to the top of Mount Zion. There's this whole party. He spins around, that whole story. He goes into the tabernacle and he's praying before God, and the word of the Lord comes to David, and this is what God says to him: when your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father. He shall be my son. So what God is promising David is the king from your line, whose kingdom will last forever, he will be my son. Which, when you go back to Mark 14, what the high priest asked Jesus, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? The idea of the Christ, the seed of David who would set up the kingdom that would last forever, that was also prophesied in Daniel and in all these different prophets, was what God told David was, that seed will be my son. So the Son of God actually is an earthly term for the natural seed of David who will rule. He will be the anointed one. So the Son of God.
So to them, they're looking for the entire Jewish religion, or the entire promise from Adam and Eve through Abraham, through Moses, through David, is this idea that from this line, from this family, there will be someone, the seed of the woman, who will crush the head. It'll be he will be the serpent crusher, the person that it literally brings, and to use this definition or this word in a biblical defined way, he will bring salvation to the people of Israel, or to all of creation, reversing the curse. This is something that these people would have been taught their entire life and would have been passed down, generation after generation within the Jewish line.
And not only that, but there's promise after promise. You could say to Eve, the seed of Eve, the seed of the woman would be the snake crusher. The seed of Abraham would be the one who brings blessing. The seed of David would be the Son of God. So every time that this family gets narrowed and narrowed and narrowed, there's a new promise and a new facet and a new thing. And so that's the whole point.
That's
is
so fascinating.
The Son of God is the facet that gets added to the promise to David, which means that counterintuitively, the Son of God is not a divine title. It is a Davidic Messianic promise. I know I use some big Bible words there, but a Davidic Messianic promise given to David about the Messianic king.
Kind of like in Dune. But
please
that's
go on.
Well, in Dune, I haven't gotten through all of it, but this idea that there is a prophesied person that will come through a line, through a certain lineage. So it's more about the Son of God is more about a lineage than an actual, this is God incarnate.
Right.
Yeah.
On the other hand, here's from Daniel chapter 7. So
Son of Man now. We're talking about
the Son of Man. Daniel sees this crazy vision where all these beasts, there's like a lion and there's a bear and there's a leopard, and then there's one that's so horrific he doesn't even have an animal to describe it. And God comes, and the thrones are laid out, and judgment, and there's this river of lava fire coming from God's throne, and he takes all of those nasty creatures and he throws them in the river of lava fire because they had been crushing God's people. And all of God's people rejoice because the monsters that were crushing them had been destroyed.
This is a vision.
This is Daniel's vision. And, you know, if you're perplexed by it, the vision ends, and Daniel is so perplexed that he, like, can't move for 3 weeks. He's, like, catatonic.
And this is symbolic.
Yes, it is symbolic. And he has an angel walking him through the entire vision. He's
right,
like,
explaining the
like,
components of it.
what does this mean? And the angel's like, let me tell you. So, in this vision,
I wonder if the angel was a big eyeball.
Was he one of the normal ones or the
Don't
eyeball
look up
ones?
the render. Don't look up a rendering of like what an actual angel would look like. You might have nightmares after that.
So this is how Daniel 7 verse 13 starts. I saw in the night visions. So as a part of all this stuff that is happening, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven to the Ancient of Days. They brought him near before him. He was given dominion, glory, a kingdom that all people, nations, and languages should serve him.
Mm.
So,
kind of like a Son of Man.
So, what's so counterintuitive? I've used that word before. What's so counterintuitive is that Son of God could be interpreted really easily as a totally not divine, as the exalted King of Israel title. But this Son of Man has been raised up and given all the things, all the titles, all the glory, all the honor, all the things that belong to God alone. So this person, and we have some documents through the Second Temple period of Judaism between Malachi and Jesus of who exactly is this guy. And you can see in these writings how the rabbis wrestled back and forth, like, well, maybe he's like the best human who ever lived. Well, maybe he is a divine human. Well, maybe it's an angel. Maybe it's because this totally perplexed them that a human being, the Son of Man, would receive all of this divine attention and authority and worship. That belongs to God alone.
So throughout history, God is revealing more and more refined revelation to Israel and to humanity, or to humanity through Israel, of who this coming Messiah, Mashiach, Christ would be, and the aspects and the titles of who he is and what he would go by.
Probably a better way to put it is that there is nothing necessarily tying this guy, the Son of Man, this character, this one thread in the tapestry to all the other threads until Jesus comes. And he claims all of those titles for himself. So the Messiah, the servant,
So Jesus is affirming, like Daniel the prophet, and saying, hey, I am that guy.
Oh, yeah. And so that is the whole point. Again, now we're wrapping it back to Mark 14. The high priest asked Jesus, are you the Son of God? Basically, are you the Davidic king? And Jesus says, yes, and not only that. Remember that guy from the book of Daniel who received a dominion and glory and honor that belongs to God alone? That's me too.
Yo.
And that is when the high priest rips his clothes and he goes, that's enough. You've heard the blasphemy. We're done.
And that's what's crazy about this. Like, did Jesus claim to be God? It's like, yes, but he claimed so much more than that. Like, to the people of Israel at the time, to these leaders, he knew exactly what he was stabbing right to the core. He's like imagine if someone's walking around saying, I'm God, but then they tell you, they go more deep, like, I am the God of Israel, I am Yahweh, I am Jesus, like in a super blasphemous way. That would be much more impactful to you than just some guy saying, oh, I'm God.
Yeah.
I'm this God, I'm the Hindu God, I'm this God.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be that big of a deal, but someone came to you and said, I am Jesus of Nazareth, like
Yes.
back from the dead, or like returned, you'd be like, that's intense.
That is not only an audacious claim, that is a very specific religious claim. And so Jesus, everybody wishes Jesus just said in very forensic terms, I'm God. But actually, what we see in Mark 14, he made very specific religious claims that were rooted in the religious tradition that they knew. And that's the whole point. That's why we launched off into this whole tangent, is they knew what he was saying. They all heard it, and they all heard it just fine. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They heard what he was saying, that he was claiming to be God. And they ticked him off so bad they killed him. Nobody in his contemporary time misunderstood him. It's only us that does not hear those religious claims that he made because we don't understand our Old Testament.
But it is starting to become more clarified when you explain it. It's like, oh gosh, that is a big deal, what he said.
Yes, it is. It is a huge deal what he said.
So where do we go on this video? Do we just continue here?
The third chapter.
Okay.
The third chapter was also worth watching.
Here's a third issue, the dating of John.
But Wes Huff thinks, based on his confidence that P52 is from the 2nd century, that we can, again, at minimum and comfortably place the Gospel of John in the 1st century. Once again, as with the Isaiah scroll, I think he's just speaking way too confidently. And to be clear, I'm not claiming that John was written late. For all I know, it could have been written the day after Jesus ascended. The point is that the authorship of the Gospels is a hotly contested issue. What Wes Huff is leaving out is just how absolutely disputed almost everything he's saying is.
But I didn't take Wes's comments here to be deceptive in his summary about John. He's allowed to advocate for his own conclusion from the data, and that conclusion is not unique to him. And he's correct that there has been a significant...
The deep irony is those claims are only hotly debated now. Amongst the people who knew the guys who supposedly wrote the Gospels, there was no debate whatsoever. They all knew and totally agreed on who wrote them. It's only now, 2,000 years later, that we go like, well, was that really that guy? But the guys who were there and knew them were like unanimously, there's like, yeah, that's who wrote it.
Yeah, I think that's why it's so important to like go back first, then forward, because you always can understand. The closer you get to the original source, the like even what we talk about a lot of times, like how is the church supposed to operate? Well, go back to the early church and go back to Jesus' teachings and the apostles. How do you understand what Jesus was saying? Go back to the books of the Bible, the Tanakh, the Old Testament, the books that he was quoting, and read and understand those. And then, with church history arguments, it's like, yes, we could have developed a refined understanding in the future, but did we? Do we have a better understanding than the 1st century followers of Jesus? And so it's like, I'm going to take the scriptural claims over church history claims thousands of years later.
I will highly, highly, highly recommend to anyone listening The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton. And one of the best things that book did for me, this is what that book is all about. Basically, that book is about people in the past were just like us. We have this whole mystification about they were ancient people, and so we look at these documents as though like they must have been either they were embellished or they were liars or they were deceived. And so we have to take every ancient document with the teeniest, tiniest grain of salt instead of just saying like, well, what if they were just telling the truth?
Yeah. And that's what we were talking about with the Billy Carson claims, because those aren't able to be validated like the scriptures are able to be historically validated. But there is some ancient civilization claims of encounters with what people call in modern day aliens that you can look at and you can say, yeah, that fits right in a biblical worldview. They could have totally had encounters with a being alien to this earth, and that's called a demon.
Yeah,
That
the
is
Bible's pretty clear.
that is called a spiritual being. There is another player in all of this besides God and man. There is other beings
Yeah.
that are a part of this, existence and equation. So, it's not that hard to look back at that, but we often, with our modern prowess, look at those and we're like, oh yeah, of course they were making up stuff about Zeus and this and this. It's like, you don't know where they got that information or who gave it. Doesn't mean it's true. It could have been a lie, but did that lie come from men making that up, or did it come from
Right.
spiritual beings?
Right. Exactly right.
That's it, exactly. All right, should we continue with this, or
It's up to you. I think we pretty much. I think there's.
let's go?
more. I
Let's
think
go a
there's
little
more.
bit longer.
Yeah, there's more in there.
Significant revision in the scholarly consensus about the dating of John and just its more general perceived historicity. For example, in 2019, James Charlesworth of Princeton Seminary wrote a book, Jesus Mirrored in John, and he discusses the paradigm shift in the scholarship away from a consensus of a later date for John. He even gives his own view that it could go back prior to 70 AD. Now, this book was published in 2019. It's fascinating to see where the scholarship is going right now. Before 70 AD seems super early, but it's interesting to see how many other serious New Testament scholars are sympathetic to this view. At least they take this very seriously. Richard Bauckham and N.T. Wright and others, if I understand from their remarks in interviews, they take this very seriously. I'm not saying they all agree on exactly the details, but they all date it very early. Now, Alex discusses an important 2005 article in the Harvard Theological Review, that journal, that contests the date of P52. But here we have to recognize the later date for P52 wouldn't require a later date for John. It just allows for that. And there's other reasons why, especially in just the last few years, a lot of scholars are advocating for an earlier date to John, and a lot of it is coming down to internal evidence. So, for example, George Van Kooten, who is the Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity at Cambridge University, is now proposing a very early date for John based on considerations like John 5:2 and its present tense description of the sheep gate. All of this is very complicated, like Alex points out. All of this is contested. And this is not my field, so I don't really have an opinion on the date of John. My scholarship is more in church history and theology. But I don't see any problem with what Wes is summarizing here. And his perspective on John is a mainstream one that others argue for as well. His description of the scholarship on this point seems fair.
All right, break it down for us.
Dude, he is so measured.
Isn't he the best?
He's just so calm and measured. We're not like that. we get a little fiery.
We could take a note. All right, break it down for us. Give us the reintegrate the context here. Why does an early date for John matter or not matter?
Kind of like what we were talking about before. The closer the manuscript, the closer to the actual events of Jesus's life, the writing is, the more that we can count it as accurate or valid. Because later on you could have, made it up, or it could have maybe not been John's account. But the closer it is to the first century, the better as far as validity goes, as far as
Right.
historical scholarship goes.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And also, the closer and closer you get, you almost get to a point where you could say, well, Peter's still alive. Like if these documents were written in their lifetimes, by them by hand, you almost get to a point where, Luke claims like, hey, I got all this information from the eyewitnesses. So they were alive. He went and asked them and collected the information. So you're almost at a certain point where the people who are reading these documents could then go ask those same eyewitnesses to validate or unvalidate these claims.
Yeah, and for people that don't know, Luke was not a Jewish man. He was
the only writer
Gentile.
of the New Testament to be a Gentile. Yeah.
Gentile, just being someone other than Jew, basically.
Right.
And what I love about Luke is that, and it's such a cool account because he didn't witness it himself, but he was an investigative journalist, essentially.
First-rate
Yeah.
historian. Yes, absolutely.
Which I just think is fascinating.
Yeah.
I like journalism a lot, so.
And it's even cool. This is just for fun, but you can tell from those first chapters, Luke includes kind of a birth story. And so you can tell that one of the people that he interviewed for his stories was Mary. Isn't that fun?
That's amazing.
That Luke probably interviewed Mary and got those early birth stories.
I mean,
from
wouldn't
her.
you? I don't know.
I mean, exactly, right? You
It's like-
you go track down the lady who knew, who was there for all of it.
And Luke is he's putting together an account for someone.
For
Right.
someone. It is unclear who
Who
that
that
person
is.
is. Either, so the name that he gives, Theophilus, means lover of God. So it could be a general title of like all people who love God, you know?
Gotcha.
Or it could be, I mean, it absolutely could refer to a specific person's name. I have heard some people even suggest that he was kind of doing the dossier report for Caesar. Remember in Paul's trials, they all ask, okay, what's going on here? And Paul says, hey, you know about the way, you know about this Jewish stuff. You'll understand when I tell you what's going on. You're very familiar with what happened with Jesus of Nazareth. Well, there's all people up the chain who don't understand what happened with Jesus of Nazareth. So there has been at least one suggestion that it's the dossier report of what the story of Jesus is for those people up the chain.
That's incredible. I wonder, like, who read that?
Could it, well, this suggestion would have been Caesar himself read the book of Luke to get an understanding of the way, who Jesus was. I don't think
That's
necessarily that's
crazy.
true. It's fun. It's fun. It's not necessarily true.
Cyphus Ignitus says Luke wasn't a disciple, he was a detective.
Dude. What an honor. What an honor to be the only Gentile. And did you know, by word count,
Yeah.
Luke wrote the most of the New Testament.
That's crazy.
Luke and Acts together,
Right.
by number of words, outnumbers all of Paul's gospel, all of Paul's epistles.
Yeah.
So Luke, the Gentile, was the greatest contributor to our New Testament.
Well, it's funny because you think of like the temperament differences between Luke and Paul. Obviously, we could never hear their words, but based on their writings, they're very different guys.
Yeah.
And, Paul was almost like, Paul was legit. Like he had authority, his testimony gave him so much authority of persecuting and putting Christians or followers of Jesus to death, then going and being like one of the, the greatest church planter that's basically ever existed. And his letters are just like, I don't think he ever intended them to necessarily be documented and read 2,000 years later. It doesn't seem like that was what he was thinking. He was trying to correct and help.
He was writing
the
an
churches.
actual letter.
Yeah, actual letter to people. And then you have this Gentile guy that's like, and he was a doctor, right? Luke was a doctor.
He was a doctor.
Trying to get down the nitty gritty. It makes sense because, like, we're Gentiles, right? You and I. And
As far as I know.
we very much have that same temperament of like, how do we validate this? How do we understand this? What is the details of like that exorcist video or the deliverance video that we saw, where it's like, how do we validate this? Let's look into the details. And so just to see that,
Can we find any corroborating evidence?
Yeah, exactly. It's to see the two different types of people play such a prominent role in the development of our New Testament. Just these two guys that we're reading about and talking about today. It's incredible.
Yeah.